welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. It's the May solo show this week, and I wanted to convey some of my impressions and experiences being at Uluru and in Australia's Red Centre last week. So I suppose we begin, inevitably with me, with cycles. So I had been there before as a kid. I was about 12, and it obviously impacted me. I was thinking about it on the plane on the way back, and it was Kakadu in particular, but also Uluru, was sort of the inspiration for my first book. When I got home, I got a little exercise book from school and started recounting on a day-by-day basis what we'd experienced and doing little drawings and so on. I was intending to give it to my paternal grandfather. He's the one who had that experience in Nauru and New Guinea and so on, and I thought this would be something he'd appreciate. Probably would have. I didn't finish it, and then he died. So an abandoned project, but nevertheless, it kind of never really occurred to me that I effectively began writing starships at the age of 12. But from a cycle perspective, there were sort of three main differences in the intervening 20 and a bit years. Firstly, we climbed Uluru, which is a nitty no-no culturally. We certainly didn't know that at the time. This is kind of one of the changes that you notice. So whilst you still technically can this year climb it, you are strongly encouraged not to. And from next year, you won't be able to. And not only because it is supremely sacred to the Ananu, who are the traditional custodians in the area, but they're also understandably upset when people fall off it and die, which several do a year. And I kind of get that. Mother didn't come with us on the climb, so it was my father took myself and my little brother. So if I was 12, he was 10. And whilst he's a fat sack of crap now, like the rest of us, at the time, he was a little bird. He was one of those 10-year-old distance runners and quite fine. In fact, his son appears to be growing into a very similar body shape, albeit without the athletic skills. So it was pretty hairy. Like, he absolutely could have been blown off. And I kind of think if Mother was aware of just how dangerous it was at the top, she may well have divorced my father at the bottom immediately. So we didn't know that, and there's some guilt and so on, but I think it is quite good that that we're finally kind of transitioning out of being able to do that. We called it Uluru, but also the kind of Anglo name is Ayers Rock, which both were used 20 or so years ago, and now you call it Uluru, and also good, right? The other big change was in terms of regeneration and greenery. Now, 20 years ago, it was what I thought it was supposed to look like, which is kind of the beautiful red dirt and spinifex grass everywhere. But it turns out, so you kind of have the tourist eyes when you look at it, but with permaculture eyes, you see a recovery species desperately trying to restore the soil back to what it's supposed to be. So if you look at it now, and this is one of the upsides of traditional custodianship, it's been replanted with the species that were supposed to be there. There was so much spinifex everywhere because improbably it seems, but nevertheless it happens because of the cattle grazing historically in the area. That does still go on and isn't done in the kind of cell grazing way it should. Certainly not done in and around Uluru. So it had been replanted to look like, I don't want to say it's supposed to, that's the wrong way of thinking with ecology, but it's been replanted so that a kind of rare and critically endangered nocturnal kangaroo called the mala can basically be restored to health itself. So the whole landscape looked very different. So that was a kind of, I guess, the two main ones. And the third one, which was tremendously encouraging and kind of relates to both, is there is a genuine interest and as a result, there are now tourist experiences that have reasonable content from an indigenous perspective. And this is, again, thanks largely to Ananu custodianship. And I'll come back to that a bit later. But inevitably, there's tourist stuff and there's tourist stuff. So we ran the numbers on it when we were there. So 400,000 people visit Uluru each year. It sounds like a lot, but you get tens of millions visiting the British Museum, and that's just a building. I mean, it's an awesome building. So it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot in a way, but it also isn't. The place I want to spend most of my time talking about in this episode is called Cave Hill. And only 400 people visit Cave Hill each year. So that's 1/1000th of the visitors who make it to Uluru. And only one tour company is even allowed there. And that's probably a big part of it. And it is because it is such a profound and intense site. It's on APY lands, and that's essentially a holding group for the native people in the area, like the Ananu and sort of similar tribes and nations. And it is several hours away from Uluru, and so you sort of go on these, you could barely call them roads, but you go on these roads for several hours south onto this enormous piece of indigenously managed land. And I mean enormous. It's 103,000 square kilometers. For context, England is only 130,000 square kilometers, so it's pretty close to England. However, it only has 2,500 people living on it. You won't find anywhere, unless you're in Antarctica, you won't find anywhere that is so sparsely populated, I don't think, anywhere else. So I think you feel it. It was a remarkable drive, let alone by the time we got there. And the reason we went, Cave Hill has the highest concentration of indigenous cave art anywhere in Australia. So obviously this was going to be my Disneyland anyway. Some of it is presumably up to 30,000 years old. So a few of them have been carbon dated, but if you look at the fact that there's so many of them in these caves and so on, indicates that this particular process and sacred site has been going on for a long time. So you kind of end up with going, well, we know it's 22,000, but that's just the first one we found, and it was astounding. Now, I need to be careful with the next bit. Cave Hill is sacred because it is a critical component of a very long songline to do with Orion and the Pleiades. So very much a starships kind of area. And we need to be careful talking about it because there is law associated with all of these things, Cave Hill. And that's law, L-A-W. And from an Aboriginal perspective, law is more than just rules or taboos. They also have a telos. Law comes from the dreaming. So kangaroo law, as an example, involves who can hunt the kangaroo and when and where. The particular dances sacred to kangaroo, the foods kangaroo likes, its life cycles, and all these other things. So it's ecosystemic philosophy and also biology or natural history. So it's not just do's and don'ts. It is the kind of metaphysical description of kangaroo in the widest possible sense. So what you have is a kind of law is a flow model of human and more than human interaction, which is really fascinating, but sometimes needs to be passed out differently for people who aren't Aboriginal, of course. And in the case of Cave Hill, as I said, this is the site of the Pleiades or Seven Sisters, Chukupa, which is the Ananu word for law in this wider sense, and also a little bit dreaming, but we will get to that. And it's a place-bound way, songlines are a place-bound way of telling story, and this Cave Hill site is part of a much longer songline of the Pleiades and Orion that runs from the northeast of continental Australia, so on the coast there, all the way through the desert and down to the southwest-ish, central south, the Great Australian Bight, if you're familiar with it. You'll find some links in the show notes, a couple of them, that give part of the Cave Hill Chukupa. There's actually there was a exhibition in Canberra to do with it. So part of the lore or story is being exported in a managed way, but I'm going to skirt around the details because that's how songlines work, and it's not mine to tell. What I can probably say is that for me, there was additional validation of the kind of macro starships thesis that I wasn't expecting. Now, if you've read it, you know that around 2/3 of the world's stories pertaining to Orion are about a hunter or a hunting group, and that number's slightly higher when you break it down to Australia specifically. And that's the same here. Orion is known amongst the Ananu as Watineru. And what I learned this time, so I knew that going in, what I learned this time is that from this part of the songline at Cave Hill, is that there is also a dismemberment motif, which is remarkably Assyrian. 2 bits in particular, obviously the head, because it's me, but also the part that men think with, which is detached in what is described in the Seven Sisters Chukupa as a second creation. And this detached part has magical powers of its own. And this was fascinating for me, because think about the part of her husband that Isis couldn't find, and thus had to magically build in order to fall pregnant with Horus. So you have additional detail of what was a broad motif at a much, much deeper time depth, I suppose. The other thing I can probably say is the songline in this landscape also has the hunter chasing the sisters into the sky motif as an extra hit on that kind of game of battleship of unpicking vastly ancient star lore survivals, right? And probably the most moving part of the entire site for me, surprisingly, wasn't the caves with the paintings in them, which were extremely impressive. But it was actually the sort of platform on the top of the outside of the rock where the sisters leave the earth from and head into the sky. And this looks out over at least 100 kilometers of flat desert before you get to some other rock formations on the horizon. And these lines are marked, there are these lines marked into the rock that point at various sources of water, not just on the rock itself, but out in the desert. So this place where they left the earth being chased by the hunter has these lines that are, if you follow them, you will not die. And here is where you get that complete collapse of difference between spirit beings originating in the stars, and the sisters actually did come down to Earth from the stars, as did all of these ancestral beings we were talking about or learning about, and them being the stars, and that kind of embedded and eerie utility of knowing the chukupa of a specific landscape. The way songlines, quote-unquote, work is they are maps across vast deserts. I believe we covered that, bigger than, well, not bigger than England, but certainly emptier and of a similar size, and that's just this native part of the land. All of Europe confidently fits into Australia, right? But how they work is you move across landscape, and different parts of landscape on the songline contain a part of the story. So story is, and time is bound by place. But crucially, the other thing is you do in fact sing parts of them. And that is an important navigational tool. So you'll sing for a certain length of time or a certain number of verses, if you will. It's not quite verses, but you get what I mean. And then you turn left or whatever it happens to be. And so if you don't know the song and you get that incorrect, you effectively miss the turnoff, and thus you have missed the water, and y'all are dead, right? So here is this way of retaining lore and metaphysics in a map that's functioned for 50,000 years. That is, at least, that is also intimately related with the stars. So you get that kind of eerie combination. There's sort of no reason why some of those lines in the rock, no materialist reason, why those lines in the rock would point to sources of water out where you can't see in the middle of the desert. And I find that kind of thing fascinating. But let me give you another example then. Everyone knows Uluru, of course, but there are 2 other enormous and vastly ancient geological formations in the area. Katajuta, which we call the Olgas, and Attila, which is Mount Connors. And these three things were formed over a 600 million year time period, starting about 1,700 million years ago. And they formed under very different geological processes. So you're not kind of dealing with the same geological event, which is obviously an ancient sea and all the other stuff that comes with it. Now, from the sky, you see that these three massive and highly sacred formations form a perfect line over about 100 kilometers. And there is no materialist reason why the world's largest monolith, it's technically not a monolith, but that's how people know it, would be in such a configuration. It's also, and this is where it gets even eerier, so this is also the oldest landscape on Earth, which happens to have traditional custodians who are the oldest continually practiced culture on Earth. Initially you think, yeah, that makes sense, but actually it doesn't. Again, there is no materialist reason why the oldest human timeline would match, out of anywhere on Earth, the oldest geological timeline. There's absolutely, that is what you call a coincidence, right? That's a coincidence. But nevertheless, it feels right. It makes a sort of sense in providing, I guess, and also being compelling evidence for an animate universe. So it's with that more analog and more lyrical approach to the human and the more than human that these things make sense. Of course, we're at a point in the timeline where the traditional custodians, who are the oldest cultures on Earth, are custodians of the oldest landscape on Earth. But otherwise, they should not have matched. And it's really fascinating being amongst that lived cosmology. In a way, that's the change. That's a big change as well from when I went as a kid. The Aboriginal lore, the parts of it you would get when I was a kid, were essentially, if you will, described in the past tense. And because there have been increased participation of traditional custodians in essentially the business of the area, you experience that lived cosmology. So it's not a historic belief system, but a lifeway that remains vibrant. And it was, in fact, the spirit beings themselves that began the process of sharing the story and the place of Cave Hill with people outside the Ananu. And I'll kind of come back to why that is important as we kind of, move forward and towards the conclusion. So when we arrived, you're kind of not guaranteed, this is a weird way of saying it, you're kind of not guaranteed an elder when you show up. Sometimes they're just not there as well. Again, you're on native lands and there's, elder business to attend to. There are funerals, there are these kind of things. So sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. We got an event when they were there. And so Stanley, the elder we met, he barely exists in our dimension. I know I've been near some powerful people, a pope, the Dalai Lama, various medicine men and women from, Mela, Poly, Micronesia, and so on. Stanley was potent just to be around, and he almost wasn't there. It was really fascinating to watch him, I guess, go through the motions of the tourist bit at the beginning, because he sort of, this is a thing we carved from that wood, have a look at this, and so on. And you could kind of see him not struggling to do it, but struggling to form a description of how this works for people who aren't Ananu. That was interesting. But he was born and raised under traditional practices and diet, so bush tucker, foraging, and so on. APY lands have their own stores now, but this wasn't the case in his day. And a couple of members of the group kind of went off with him and asked him stuff about his parents and so on. So here's someone who was they still live it, but he was born in that exact kind of life way. And one of the changes, again, that sort of past tense thing, since I came to the area as a kid, is the interaction with living spirit traditions, which makes probably a lot of sense to people listening to this show. But essentially, outsiders get different parts of the story at different times, depending on their attitude and their capacity to handle it. And this is sort of replicated in living initiatory customs around the world and so on. And it was kind of poorly described by a couple of the guides we had over the course of the week. But it made complete sense to one of them. This remarkable Belgian woman who had previously worked in African game reserves, and she's on a tourism career, right? And she came out here a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, a bit more, and stayed until her visa expired, went home, got sponsored, came back, and has been in the area for at least 2 years. And she says it feels like this is her home. She's learning the local language, and something she confessed to Mother on the drive back from Cave Hill. She's also a pranic healer, and so has some kind of personal sense of the reality of the things the Ananu are talking about. So she gets different or extra parts of the Chukupa from various elders because she can, in several respects, I suppose, handle it. Actually, I mean, she was a remarkable guide to have as a result. In fact, when we got back, Catherine Austin Fitz, because it's a Solari event, we got out of the van and Catherine gave her a big hug and said she's the best guide in America before realizing, oh, wait, it's Australia. Best guide in Australia. I like the America bit better because there's 330 million people rather than 25, and she probably would be the best guide in America. Anyway, when we were out at Cave Hill, there were only men there, so we had Stanley the elder and a couple of the people, younger men who he was clearly teaching, and they were sort of learning not just the law, but also how to be a guide for these groups, right? And here's an example of law. Witchetty grubs. Part of Witchetty grub law is that only women can harvest them, and they were supposed to be on the lunch menu. So there was this challenge. And the men who were there went and found the acacia tree that had some grubs underneath it, as far as they could tell, in the root zone area. And then they came back and got this guide and instructed her, this Belgian woman, how to dig for them. But she did the digging because it's witchetty grub law that women dig the grubs. And it wasn't really mentioned or possibly noticed by the other guests. But Mother and I were aware of how significant it is that this Belgian woman got to do that. And that's an indication of the kind of open, closed door, hall of mirror system of being sympathetic, but on the outside, at least for now, of a living tradition. But it was a big deal that she got to do this, and I think is a testament to how seriously the Ananu take her seriousness, if that makes sense. And that's a real change from when I was growing up. In fact, so the opening up of Cave Hill to the couple of hundred annual visitors each year was directed by the ancestors themselves. So you're kind of seeing, and I thought about that in conjunction with this Belgian woman harvesting the witchetty grubs. There's been a step change in the spirit world's policy regarding the preservation and dissemination of Aboriginal wisdom in the last few decades, at least in part to preserve it. So the biggest hurdle for Aboriginal peoples is one shared by indigenous nations around the world at the moment, which is that the young people no longer know the Chukupa and are less and less interested in it in the face of the distractions of the modern world. But there are still law aspects to this policy change and opening up. So, for instance, Stanley, I mentioned this earlier, but firstly, there are no photos allowed in the caves or the area that is most significant as part of the songline, and that Aboriginal peoples have a far more nuanced understanding of depiction, obviously, 50,000 years practice, than we do. So I know a couple of people asked me about this on Twitter, and they assumed it was the high volume of people coming through the cave and flashes would damage it. It's not. There's only a couple of hundred people, and it has nothing to do with that kind of Sistine Chapel stuff. It is because of the sanctity of image and how you're essentially violating law by exporting part of the songline by doing that. And so there's some real thinking that's gone behind this. Stanley, the elder I mentioned, for instance, had to paint over some of the paintings in the main cave, which is astounding. Speaking of the Sistine Chapel, this was better. But he had to paint over some of them because law. So if you're not part of this, if you're not Ananu, and specifically you're not associated with that songline, you don't get it. But he also, and you'll find this, I think, in one of the links, it's for the protection of people who aren't initiated. And that is the same, in a way. The protection is really real. That is the same as when I visited as a kid. So we were told that the main visitor center, so back near Uluru, still gets rocks sent back to it from tourists from all over the world. Now, obviously, you're not supposed to take them because it's A, a sacred site, and B, a national park. But people still do, and it often does not go well. So, 50,000 years of practice with operating with the more than human world. If they tell you not to do something, don't fucking do it, right? And this brings the story back to those strange alignments of the massive rock formations and that kind of even stranger overlap of human and geological timelines. And I promised a couple of premium members I'd try to fold this alignment and this sort of mysterious coinciding into an attempted description of the dreaming. We went into it in the journeying course as part of a global comparison to the process Carl Jung went through in creating the Red Book and with other journeying system and so on. So essentially, here's the tea with the obvious klaxon-sounding warning that this is a bundling up of a bunch of different people's cosmologies based on the parts they are willing to share with outsiders, done by someone who is not a member of any of these nations. So it's wrong, right? It's wrong, but it's potentially a useful kind of wrong if you know that going in. A good example of how it's wrong, for instance, just going back to the Ananu specifically, is Chukupa, as I said, means law, but it also sort of means dreaming. So, because they are intimately related, as we're about to find out, but that is essentially the one word doing double duty for both. So Chukupa and law and dreaming are all that kind of conflated one concept. So what I'm about to say doesn't even work for the Ananu. Nevertheless, the shape of the dreaming and or dream time is present. It is a universal among all Aboriginal nations in the same way you get, say, monotheism as a shape behind about a dozen cosmologies that shared time and place. They're, expressed differently. So that's when I talk about dreaming, I'm talking about it. Your intellectual reference is monotheism. Like, I'm talking about something that doesn't really exist, but it does. It's a kind of intellectual artifact, right? So, if you've read Starships or Dr. Witzel, these are Gondwana cosmologies, which means they're eternalist. So the universe always existed. It's not that beginning to end of the world creation story you get with the Laurasians. And a little sidebar, I think that will turn out to be scientifically accurate in our lifetime. And I wrote a bit about the Big Bang in Pieces of 8, but probably most of you are on board with that notion. So the ancestor beings were these vast, at the time, they still are, but like these vast kind of unbounded, formless forms, almost, the impression is kind of like a vibratory or energy grid. And they could form into any shape or animal or plant. And they created essentially by singing their own vibratory frequency. So it goes from a sort of inward to outward manifestation. And as they moved across the earth, camping each night, they would dream of where they were going to go next and what they would make or shape. And upon waking, they would fulfill these dreams in the physical. So everything in creation runs on a very Charles Fort spectrum between the unmanifest and the manifest. Part of this manifestation is also lore. So you sort of sing kangaroo lore into creation, which includes its physical moment. And so you can see why lore is more widely applied in Aboriginal cultures, right? So the majority of kangaroo is this ancestral dreaming, and what we observe of its physical expression is the tip of a tiny iceberg. And this isn't the bit that I think people, and I fell for this as a kid as well, like this is more or less how it was described to me, is we assume it's a one-off event. So you think dreamtime dreaming, and you go straight to a mid-20th century esoteric idea that the universe was dreamed into existence by some being or collection of beings. And it's not that. The universe is continually powered by the dreaming, if that makes sense. So it kind of runs off it. And I don't want to use the word hologram, but you get the idea. So it's continually, creation is continuous and eternal. And it continually moves along this manifest, unmanifest spectrum from dreaming to the physical without ever losing one part when it's in the other. This is a really Charles Fort idea. So this is how the ancestor beings can be both the stars and from the stars, and how Uluru can be fully alive. So Uluru has its lore of its creation, but it is a lot of the ancestor beings, when they were done singing and shaping, either became tired or retreated into the physical form of the thing that they created. And so they are that at all times. In some Aboriginal cultures, I'm not sure about the Unanu actually, but upon waking, one would ritualize something that you recalled from that night's dreams. And it could just be a little whistle or a drawing made in the dirt. And this is to demonstrate to the surrounding spirits that you are a being that moves between worlds. Or along the spectrum is more accurate, like the ancestor beings. And so you see why we explored the notion in the context of Jung's Red Book, of course, because he would do his active imagination exercises, and then he would physicalize them in the paintings and the description of the book. So there are Western parallels that strongly suggest there's an underlying reality to all of this. So that's why this came up twice, which is surprising given the people we were with, but I presume a lot of you have read The Invisibles, and there's that bit where King Mob does go to Uluru, and he's asked if he has a dreaming. Now you kind of understand what that means. It's like, do you have an interiority, and are you aligned with who you are and where you come from, and in the wider context of law? So if you've got a dreaming, or if a place has a dreaming. And one of the challenges, of course, with Anglo-Australians is they've lost their dreaming. And there is a risk that, this is the kids these days not interested in chukupa stuff. That's the risk that I think the elders in the spirit world are attempting to mitigate with these kind of changes in policy in terms of who's in and out. And the other thing I promised a couple of premium members was, here's the thing, you'll notice there isn't a good book on any of this stuff, and it's because it's not book-shaped. This stuff can't be conveyed. And also, you couldn't do it as a sort of how-to guide because you're not, unless you are, you're not from these peoples. So I thought about this. And the best book that I think gives a feeling for this, and is also part of this project of making sure the law or the chukupa survives externally. There's a book called Old Man's Story. And this is it's written by a white fella. His name's Mark Lang, but crucially, he's a photographer. And much like this Belgian woman, this is from peoples much further north in Kakadu. He's the old man in this is old Bill Meiji, who's a Kakadu elder who's now dead. And kind of perceiving his last couple of years are coming, he befriends this guy, Mark, and much like the Belgian woman, Mark had been working in Kakadu and was very interested in it, but crucially, he's a photographer. So it's a very sensitive book because you get exactly as Bill spoke, the transcription of his stories, but because Mark's a photographer, you get pictures of country at the same time. So whilst it's not the same as participating in the songline by place, it's as close as you're going to get with a printed product. And you actually get that journey of I'll tell you this bit, then I'll tell you that bit, over the course of a year as the seasons change. And towards the end, old Bill he explains, like, the reason I'm doing this is our young people, I haven't found any young people to pass this on to. So it has to continue in some form, and I hope this is it. And by the end of it, the kind of opening and closing, you get a little bit, then you don't. It's full. The spirits of the dead come back to me in physical form. I know you don't believe me, but that's what happens here, and so on. So you begin with creation dreaming about Chicken Hawk and rock and all this. And by the end of it, by the end of this kind of interaction and journey, it's a remarkable book. So it's called Old Man's Story, and it's the last thoughts of Kakadu elder Bill Naiji. And if you're kind of interested in getting that non-linear chukupa, they don't use the word, they're not ananu, that would be where I would suggest, because it's very difficult to obviously pull out of place, as is everything. So that's the book recommendation. That's the description of dreaming. That's my story of Cave Hill, which was personally astounding and beautiful. And there are photos and so on the post page at runesoup.com. As some of you know, I went with a Solari group organized by Catherine Austin-Fitz and Jason Borden-Smith. Both of them and Richard Dolan gave some presentations and facilitated some really good, long, detailed discussions with other Solari attendees over the week, none of which I will tell you about, obviously. I've done international events. It's one of those things. It's like live music. You have to be there, right? What I can tell you is that Richard Dolan surprised us all, and even in a way the event organizers, by making a last-minute change to his metaphoric rider. He requested a surprise wedding to his much, much better half, Tracy, which we were all super excited to be involved in. I was joking about this with Greg Carlwood when I got back. So every year, I seem to go to the conspiracy wedding of the season. Last year it was his, obviously, in San Diego. And this year it was Richard Dolan getting married at sunset in front of Uluru, officiated by Catherine Austin-Fitz. So, currently taking suggestions for 2019 so as to get the trifecta. Anyway, that's the solo show for this month. Like I said, there are images from the trip and a couple of links regarding the Seven Sisters Chukupa over on the blog. I've got some splendid guests coming up over the next few weeks, so, be sure to do that subscribe thing and all that. But yeah, until next time.